The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Friday, February 24th. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Sean Illing, writer at Vox, on Richard Rorty's prescient warnings for the American left. Heard a little bit about Richard Rorty after the election. He wrote some stuff that was sort of like eerily prescient. Oh, that's where you get the title. Prescient. He wrote something that, like Richard Rorty's prescient warnings for the American left. Interesting conversation with Sean Illing, smart guy. And this is the last of our vacation shows. Sad. Right now, I'm probably going like, oh, I can't believe this week that Donald Trump has already committed us to a ground war in the Middle East. He has been impeached and then re-voted back in. He has announced that he's marrying Ivanka. What do you think else? Honestly, it's been 5 days. We've been off the air now, live. We're not live. The chances of this being the calm week are nil. I mean, usually when we take vacation, there's always like one big news story that happens, right? And then people on Twitter are like, oh, God, Sam, this is not the week for you to take off. And it happens almost every time. And then I was like, how are we going to take time off with like Trump? Because like every day, it's like dog's years, right? Like every day feels like 6 months. I mean, honestly, by this time, like Monday could have been, like, for all I know, they dropped the PP videos, right?
Or Russia, like, has a blockade on New York.
I mean, maybe people can't even listen to this because iTunes has been taken over, and if it's not in the original Russian, honestly, I know there's some like insane thing happened. So you can check out my Twitter feed, and I'm sure I've gone crazy on it, even though I had sort of like vowed I wouldn't do that. But what can I do, folks? I mean, I got a love-hate relationship with this. I'm obsessed by it, and then I'm like, I'm too obsessed by it. And I'm like, I know, I'll take a break from it by reading more of it. And that doesn't work. But this interview with Sean Illing, I think you'll enjoy. We will be back live on Monday. I'm not sure if it'll be Michael or I. But either way, it'll be great content. Matt, you're going to have to tear yourself away from your video console. You're going to have to
I'll probably get saturated with the video game console over the break, I think.
You're going to have to lay off all of your medicines that you take during break. Show up on Monday. You better start now. Just walking yourself down. Get back to eating like normal foods, normal times of day. No more staying up till like 4 a.m. playing video games and waking up at like 10:30, 12, 2. What am I saying? 2:30. I don't think Matt at this point has seen sunlight probably in 5 days. All right, folks. Here's that interview. A quick break interview. And don't forget, your membership is what makes this show possible. Become a member today at jointhemajority.com. Quick break. Here's an interview with Sean Illing. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Sean Illing. He is a writer at Vox.com. Specifically, we're talking about Richard Rorty's Prescient Warnings for the American Left. Welcome to the program, Sean.
It's great to be here, Sam. I love the show.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. All right, so who's Richard Rorty?
Well, he's a semi-obscure academic philosopher who became sort of mainstream when he wrote a few books. But he was a liberal, kind of postmodernist, pragmatic philosopher who wrote a lot of books in the 80s and the 90s. And he wrote a book called Achieving Our Country, which was published in 1998, and it was based off of a few lectures that he had given the year before, where he told a kind of story about the history of the American left in the 20th century. And it was a kind of critique of the American left, but it was from the left. He himself was very much a liberal. He was the son of communist parents, and so he very much grew up in that tradition. But some of the things he said now read a bit like prophecy, and so I wrote a piece just sort of not necessarily applauding everything he wrote, but at least I thought it was worth revisiting.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, let's dig into that. I mean, there was a little bit, people touched on it a little bit right after the election. I think maybe like the Times had a piece of just a quote, but you dug deeper into his work, and let's talk about what he saw sort of pre-1960 and then post-1960. And I should also say that I think like around the time that he was talking about this, there were others who had talked about this cleave that took place in the 60s between two elements of, I guess, the left. But what did he say specifically?
Yeah, he's definitely not the first to make this argument. He just did it. He just distilled it really nicely. What he does is divide the left into two camps, right? And so the first is what he calls the reformist left, right? And that lasts from 1900 to about 1964, right in the middle of the sort of Vietnam protest and the countercultural movement. And then the left after that, from 1964 onward, he calls the cultural left. And his basic argument is that the reformist left was pragmatic in a very particular way, right? So the idea was that they would pursue change, right? Liberal, socialistic aims, and they would pursue those changes through and by the means of constitutional government, right? So retail politicking, winning elections, installing technocrats and bureaucrats into office, into government, so that they can kind of navigate the machinery of liberal democracy and get stuff done. And so, but politically, it was about, it was what liberalism was always about, right? Old school leftist, redistributionist economics, right? Labor, 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 class, class, class. That's what it was all about. And so the idea was that they would pursue these kind of top-down initiatives that tried to help people who were humiliated by poverty and unemployment. And that was more or less the kind of MO until the mid-'60s, at which point, again, this is Rorty's argument, that there was a shift, right? The anti-Vietnam protests became a sort of widespread condemnation of American culture as such. It became very anti-communist. And Rorty says that the locus of influence, the locus of intellectual influence on the left shifted really. And it became located in the academy, right, in the universities. And the left, although I hate to use a term like the left, it's not entirely clear who that refers to, but these are the kind of unwieldy terms that he uses. He thought that the left became more interested in cultural reasons and less political at that point. And so the focus was on a politics of identity or difference or recognition, right? And so the left had rightly realized that African Americans and minorities had been left behind by all these gains that were made by the reformist left, like FDR and the New Deal and all the rest of it. But Rorty says that they became disenchanted with the system and became more interested in improving the cultural status of these groups that had been left behind. And he doesn't object to any of that, but he thinks it came at a price. He thinks that the left and the Democratic Party got away from labor. It got away from redistributionist economics. It got away from leftist politics and became more about culture, and that was tactically a disastrous decision because it helped pave the way for, among many other things, Donald Trump.
And we'll read that passage in a bit, which is his prediction was pretty spot on. But does he, when he talks about this, I mean these two different eras of the left, I mean simultaneous and even obviously sort of predating Vietnam as a big political issue, we have the civil rights movement, right? And we also have a civil rights movement that is also, in the form of Martin Luther King, also becomes, and maybe throughout it was still very tethered, it seems to me, to the economic fate of people. I mean, we're talking about a Memphis strike, a labor strike. We're talking about marches that have to do with poor people. I mean, how did that get lost? Does Rorty ever sort of address that, or is it I mean, he's painting obviously with a big broad brush, and he's not here to sort of fill in these holes. But I mean, I think there is. We've definitely, it's not, I mean, I think this idea of the left becoming about social emancipation more so in the 60s versus economic issues. I guess the question is how did some of that get lost? And B, was it also, a certain amount of the car had been, you caught the car on some level, at least, for the 60s.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm critical of Rorty in the piece because although I think he makes some really important broad points, this distinction that he draws between the reformist left and the cultural left is really crude, and it works really well for an analysis of the kind he's making here. But I'm not sure it captures reality perfectly. I mean, we get the big Civil Rights Act and all the rest of it in 1964. And then after that, on his observation, what else do we really get accomplished? For him, the guiding principle of the cultural left was that the system and not just the laws had to be changed altogether. Like America was just sort of culturally bankrupt and just irredeemably racist. And the whole thing had to be changed at a systemic level, which is a kind of pivot away from this idea that, well, things are bad, but we can improve them gradually through policy and through winning elections. And so those are two different projects for Rorty.
It's also sort of fascinating that the left starts to adopt this notion that the system is worthless after we've had, at the very least, some fairly major concrete accomplishments by the system 2 or 3 years prior.
Yeah, it is. And I think Rorty, where he goes wrong is, although he sort of gestures to this every now and again, he's never really clear that this is not, it doesn't have to be an either or proposition. It's not like the Democratic Party or liberals shouldn't or can't talk about race or gender or sexual orientation or all the rest. He just says that for some reason they treated it like it was an either or. And at the same time that they made this move to focusing on these cultural identity issues, they just retreated to the economic center and just became terrified to say anything that was even remotely socialistic or anything that even hinted at redistribution. And in doing that, they basically aided the libertarians and the right and the corporatists, the people who wanted more deregulation, the people who wanted to basically impose a kind of neoliberal paradigm on the country, and they have.
Do you think it was a democratic retreat, or was it simply a democratic strategy? I mean, I think that, there's been a lot of scholarship that has come out, it seems to me, in the past couple of years, I'm thinking like Lily Geismer and sort of the work that's
Yeah.
been done on, Thomas Frank. A lot of his book is, I think, based upon a lot of her work on the sort of conscious effort of the Democratic Party, and particularly coming out of sort of the McGovern era, and in some respects, McGovern's commission. I mean, ironically, right, that 68 is supposed to open up the convention, or I should say the party, to less backroom dealings, and maybe by design too, it diminishes the power of labor, at least institutional labor unions, and sort of looks to the suburbs for more electoral power. I mean, is there a sense? Do you have a sense of what caused what the causal relationship was there? Or are those two sort of like coincidences that just happen to fit nicely with each other?
It's hard to say, and Rorty certainly isn't really clear about this. Right? It's not as though there's some cabal of leftists, sitting in a room. We just said, all right, guys, I guess this reformist stuff isn't working anymore. Let's pivot. It just kind of happened. And for Rorty, it almost doesn't matter how it happened. It just matters that it did. And so on just a practical level, we should at least recognize that and try to adjust before it's too late. I mean, for my part, I don't know if it was so much of a retreat. It just sort of followed naturally, or just sort of emerged out of the environment of the 60s. There's just a whole sort of countercultural movement of the 60s, the sort of protest movement in general. It just sort of spawned a different kind of politics on the left, and that also reoriented the right. And it in a lot of ways, it really changed our the terms and then the paradigm for sort of how we talk about the left and the right. And it hasn't really changed much since, and we're still sort of stuck with the legacy of that.
Let me read that passage that has been passed around quite a bit, but if people haven't heard it, it's worth it's worth reiterating. And this is in '97, right? And it's
he gives this lecture in 1997.
And this is a time, I mean, for people to remember, where you started to see we were, like, I guess, still on the underside of the dot-com bubble, but there was like this sense. There was definitely, we were just on the verge. I mean, I'm trying to remember just in terms of we had come out of a recession in the early 90s, and there was this sense that a lot of people were getting rich, right. I think. And there was a real sense that that people had, I think, that like, you better get on this train right now because it's leaving the station. And the real estate prices started going up. It was a very odd time. And maybe I'm thinking about it in retrospect and, a year or two later, but he writes, members of labor unions and unorganized, unskilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from sinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. This is, of course, too, within a couple of years in the wake of NAFTA. Around the same time, they will realize that suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed, and they'll start looking for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he's elected, the smug bureaucrats, tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, and postmodernist professors will no longer be calling the shots. I mean, did that happen? I mean, I know that they're on the right. There's that sense of smug bureaucrats, tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, postmodernist professors. And non-suburban could include really rural or, I guess, urban. But I don't get the sense that necessarily has happened in the urban. I mean, I think mean, how much of this actually happened, when we look at like the numbers of the election, or was it really that dramatically different than it was in 97, I guess is my question.
Well, I think it helps to note that he's thinking of Pat Buchanan here. Right? And so what Rorty's worried about is you have two things happening simultaneously on the left, right? You have this sort of retreat towards the economic center, right? And so he's thinking of really starting with Jimmy Carter in a lot of ways, and certainly with Bill Clinton, where Democratic Party just completely embraces neoliberalism. And then at the same time, they're still relying on these sort of identity-based coalitions. And so Rorty sees a guy like Pat Buchanan come along, who is tapping into this populist right? And so he sees that there's a part of the population, certainly the white working class, the rural white population, that is being ravaged by globalization, whose wages have grown stagnant. They don't see, they can see their economic future, and it's dark. And his concern was that if that happened, that these people would give themselves over to a kind of ethno-nationalist, firebrand, strongman type. And in many ways, Pat Buchanan was a kind of precursor. I mean, Trump is really a phenomenon all unto himself, but he's of that. The same people that were attracted to Pat Buchanan are almost certainly attracted to Trump, and for very similar reasons. And so that was Rorty. He was thinking of Pat Buchanan, but he was also projecting outward, thinking if it keeps trending in this direction, we might get someone infinitely worse than Pat Buchanan. And I think Trump is that. I think he's that strong man that Rorty writes about in that passage.
It's interesting too. I mean, I guess this is it's still a couple of years probably after like guys like Morton Downey Jr. and that show that he had.
Yeah.
I mean, that is. I mean, on some level, right? I mean, that was, and that was also, in '97, we have witnessed the Newt Gingrich revolution, as it were, and the Rush Limbaugh revolution. And I think there was sort of a growing awareness of this element in our society, and I guess it's Donald Trump did win, and I mean that's the it didn't maybe just by a hair, but nevertheless I guess that was what pushed it over there. So he's talking more about the division, I guess, or you say that Rorty's argument. That difference between the reformist left and cultural left, the division has more to do with tactics than it does principles. Is that the case, and how does that play out?
Well, I think by that, so he's talking about, so you have these people, so think of the Kennedy administration, right, which is filled with all these sort of, kind of Harvard Ivy Leaguer technocrat types. Now, many people would consider them sort of establishment or bourgeois Democrats, but they did share fundamental principles with people who called themselves socialists or even communists. Right? They wanted an entitlement system. They wanted to clamp down on the free market, and they wanted a fair and equitable distribution of wealth. They just tried to they made certain compromises in order to form coalitions and get things done, at the policy level. And so, what was I almost forgot your question. I almost kind of went off track.
Well, I mean, at one point, and you're right, the best way to make sense of Rorty's argument is to follow it chronologically. He sees the left is split into these two camps.
Yeah.
The division has more to do with tactics. But on some level, I wonder if I mean, it's very hard when we're talking about the left, right? And we're talking about, on some level, the question is, did it seems to me that there was also that fundamental perspective that changed, and there was an opportunity for at least the institution of the Democratic Party to move to the right. And it wasn't just simply about tactics, that maybe the Democrats, from an electoral standpoint, changed tactics insofar as, look, we're going to appeal. And, we saw this play out right in this election, right, with Clinton, where the most, I think, generous perspective on their electoral strategy was that they were maybe 5 years out ahead of what was perceived to be a demographic change, that the Rust Belt was less relevant now to the Southwest and the West for a Democratic coalition, and how that also demographically, overlaid even in the Rust Belt, where, Chuck Schumer had said for every blue collar vote we lose, we'll pick up 2 in the suburbs, which didn't quite work out that way. So, I mean, from the Democratic Party's perspective, it's tactics, right? We're going to go more with a cultural identity. But from the left itself, was it just a reorientation? I mean, or was it something greater than that?
You talking about with Clinton, or just sort of more generally?
Well, I guess maybe in that era.
Certainly the Clinton strategy, which was, obviously, in retrospect, it's easy to condemn, but their strategy was, look, we're just going to rely on the Obama coalition, and then our entire positive agenda is just going to be, hey, the other guy is fucking insane, you can't vote for him, and that's it. They didn't really go to those union halls. Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. They just relied on this, or they assumed that this coalition, or this cluster of coalitions that of voters that tend to vote Democrat, they just assumed that they would, and obviously that was just a catastrophic error.
Indeed. In fact, Rorty at one point, I'm going to read his prediction of what would happen at the, on the other end of this. He writes, the thing that is very likely to happen is that the gains made in the past 40 years by black and brown Americans and by homosexuals will be wiped out. Jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion. The words nigger and kike will once again be heard in the workplace. All the sadism with which the academic left has tried to make unacceptable to its students will come flooding back. All the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet. If this were to happen, Rorty added, it would be a calamity for the country and the world. So that's his prediction.
We're pretty damn close to that, wouldn't you say?
Today, and we've pre-recorded this for next week, but today we started off the show by playing just Donald Trump's refusal to see the words anti-Semitism. I don't think we need to argue as to whether or not we are close to this type of era. Did he have another chapter? Was there a return of the Jedi type of thing situation here, or did he just was that where it ended?
No, I'm sorry to say. And this is where a lot of people kind of roll their eyes. In terms of Rorty's sort of solutions, the best he can do is really say, look, he points to people like Walt Whitman and John Dewey, and he said, like, Democrats, liberals have got to get back to, you can do 2 things, right, when you're trying to sell a political vision, right? You can appeal to nostalgia, right, which is what reactionaries do, which is what Donald Trump did, make America great again. Mm-hmm. But that is regressive and destructive and certainly anti-progressive. Right? You can do that, or you can offer a vision of that is positive, that is oriented towards the future, that gives people something to aspire. Right? He calls this kind of it's a politics of national pride. Right? And he says that the Democrats sort of got away from that. They spended more time sort of with recriminations and talking about all these different sort of cultural issues, and they got away from selling a narrative that projected outward and that was positive, that people could unify around, and in doing that, they sort of ceded this space to the right, to the populist right in particular, and they've seized upon it, and now we are where we are, and it's a bad time to be a progressive.
I mean, how much of that do you think was necessary, and if so, does it remain necessary? Right? I mean, if you're an African American, and you're obviously growing up aware of the relationship that the police have with the black community, and then of course it becomes that much more undeniable for the broader society because of cell phones, right? And video
Right.
on demand. I mean, I guess, how do you reconcile those things? Where, I think there is a very legitimate perspective of, you can have this aspirational quality to it and, achieving our country. But, there are some who would argue that, that's also that achieving our country, even that frame, saying that, we have these ideals that we haven't met yet, but we need to continue to pursue them, sort of fundamentally ignores the fact that those ideals, even in and of themselves, those ideals are forged on a fundamental lie. Like those aspirations itself, like our ability to aspire to those ideals is corrupt on some level.
Right. And I even, I talk about this near the end of the piece. I mean, this is this idea that you can somehow just not talk about the past as though there isn't a causal connection between the injustices of the past and the injustices of the present. I mean, there obviously is. And I don't see any clear way around that. I mean, again, the best Rorty can say is all those things are true, right? America is in many ways a failed promise. The Declaration of Independence is in many ways a lie for much of the country. Now we can talk about that, or we can try to win an election and then change things materially. And he's really just making it's a purely pragmatic, purely strategic argument. I mean, from his perspective, this is not about winning an argument. It's about winning elections. It's about doing politics. And politics in a liberal democratic system like ours requires compromise, and it requires persuading people. And that's difficult to do if you're promoting an agenda that encourages people to sort of retreat into their groups, along whatever lines they happen to be defined. And that's really the best he can offer.
I think there was a sense that Bernie Sanders was attempting to do that, what now feels like months and months and months ago, but I guess it was really like 6 weeks ago, right, when there was a sense of I don't think people fully realized just how insane things would be at this point. I mean, now, the idea of Bernie Sanders coming out and saying, if President Trump does something that I think is good, I'm going to be with him on it or something, now just sounds ridiculous. And so how does this, how does it happen now in this context, right? I mean, there's, he really should have kept writing, Rorty. I mean, just a little bit more. He needed to really think that last part out, what happens once you get that guy in office.
Yeah, that guy had a lot of balls dying before he wrote that next book.
Indeed.
Well, I mean, look, my closing thought was there is some reason to think that he's onto something here, right? And so Bernie Sanders proved that if you go to the country, this self-identifies as a socialist. He went to the country with a leftist, populist agenda, and look what he was able to accomplish. It's just unbelievable in retrospect. What he was able to do. And so clearly there's an appetite for that. People will respond if you're willing to go there. And the Democrats for so many years have not. And then on the other hand, you have someone like Barack Obama, who is in many ways really an exception. I mean, he's just an extraordinary candidate with an extraordinary story and just an extraordinary political acumen. But he did what Rorty recommended insofar as he was almost to a fault optimistic. I mean, all you heard from Obama was about achieving a more perfect union and how America can live up to its promise and how the story is only possible in America, and on and on and on. If you combined Obama's political optimism with Bernie's economic populism, that to me is a winning formula for the Democratic Party, for the left. And to me, that's the best formula I can see.
Do you think there's even do you think that the left would accept that today, though? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have a certain myopia. I mean, just because I spend all my time on with my whatever, how many hundreds of people are on my Twitter feed, and that's these days over the past couple of weeks. But I mean, do you think that that even that rhetoric now would be okay? I mean, is there enough people on the left who are paying attention to just like policy?
I don't know. And to tell you the truth, I'm just not very optimistic about any of this. I mean, I don't, we are where we are. And right now, people are right to be pissed off. They're right to be hysterical. They're right to not be in the mood for reconciliation. I mean, we're in a crisis, and now the sort of mood is one of resistance and fighting, and I get that, and that's where I am too. And so I worry that we may have sort of crossed a kind of threshold here where things have just gotten so Manichean, I mean, so divided, so fractured, so hysterical, really, that this idea of sort of reaching out or extending an olive branch, it seems very much at odds with the spirit of the time. But things can change pretty quickly.
And when you say that, are you talking about left, right, or are you talking even within the left? And I mean, because on some level, like I noticed yesterday, I think there was Keith Ellison and Tom Perez were spotted going out to dinner with each other. And I imagine, who knows what they were talking about. It's intriguing. It's really interesting. But the immediate response is, is Keith Ellison selling people out? What is, there's such a huge level of distrust and such an impatience with just doing politics. If Keith Ellison ends up being the chair of the DNC, you want him to go out to dinner with these people. You want him to go out to dinner with everybody, right? Because you're going to bring these people along. They're just, I wonder if we're at a time where even, that fracturing it's genuine fracturing. It's not just a break and a half, but the pieces are all over the place.
That might be the case. I would say I'm slightly more optimistic about the ability of the left to coalesce. I mean, the left-right divide, to me now, just seems just hopelessly unbridgeable. But there's a lot of political energy on the left right now, and it does give me some hope that anytime you would lose a big election, a big consequential election like this, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and a lot of kind of post hoc, autopsies about what happened and what went wrong and all the rest of it. But it does seem to me that a good chunk of the left has realized, look, we've got to rethink what we're doing here because it's not working. And the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States is evidence that it's not working. Now, is that going to translate into more solidarity on the left between all these sort of subgroups? I don't know. I think it's certainly possible, but if we can't get our shit together after this, that's not very inspiring. I'll put it that way.
Well, Sean, I'm going to take that as an optimistic note in which to end on, because we can take them where we get them. Sean Illing, Vox.com. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
You got it, Sam. It was a pleasure.